Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And today is a sad day in the United States of America as a former president, Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States, is officially being laid to rest today. So I think instead of doing our traditional heritage episode, we are going to do a slight memorial episode and give people a small rundown of who Jimmy Carter was and some of the great long lasting impacts he has on our nation. Because one of the things I think that speak wonders about Carter is a lot of his policies have been truly evergreen and truly have laid forth a lot of things that we consider foundational in our country to this day. And above all, he was a man of the people, for the people, by the people. I mean, his whole election campaign was he's just a peanut farmer from Georgia, and truly a salt of the earth man. And we lost one of the best humans to have ever occupied the office. I mean, Carter's post presidency life was decades where he became a private citizen, which he considered the highest honor, and he spent those years dedicated to continuously serving the people. Whether it was diplomatic missions that he served on behalf of our nation, or even the number of years he spent with Habitat for Humanity, Carter was an incredible person. And yeah, tangent
Yeah, I think
aside, I just wanted to do a little
yeah,
memorial for him here.
I think everyone knows him most for that post-presidency work as Habitat for Humanity because let's be honest, um, it pretty much immortalized him.
I mean,
That
above
yeah,
all else, Carter had one of the longest presidential retirements ever, and is the only former United States president to live to be to the age of 100. It's not a very long living job. The people who occupy the office don't tend to have the longest retirements, especially
yeah,
because they enter office at a fairly old age. Carter was in his 50s when he was elected, so one of the more younger people to occupy the office.
yeah, definitely, yeah, definitely. That's the oldest living president. I think now goes to Biden at this point.
Yeah,
Uh, that's where we're at. We went from all the way back in the 1970s with Carter to the last guy to leave.
yeah.
Uh,
It's very interesting, and I think the Carter presidency at the time was extremely controversial, and we'll talk about some of the reasons as to why. And
yeah,
unfortunately, a lot of the stuff he does during his presidency lead to the election of Ronald Reagan, his successor, and led to the quite a big blowout that occurred in that election. It is one of the most lopsided in American history.
yeah. And a big part of the reason for that was Carter's policy is 100% the reason why he is a single term president, because this was a man who was willing to effectively destroy his political chances to do what he believed was the right thing for the nation. This man did not care about things like reelection or power. It was what he felt was right, was what his administration was going to do, and that's something you almost never see in leadership these days.
And it just goes to show just what a man of the people he was, because his big thing starting off on the presidential gambit tour basically was he wasn't well known. He wasn't a career politician. I mean, a lot of people questioned him and went, Jimmy who? And it even boiled down to one of the things he wanted to do is have a government as good as its people. He wanted to show the American people that the government could be beneficial, could do well, and could have a beating heart and could have ethics associated with it. And one of the crazy things to me that I find very impressive is when Carter was sworn into office, when he won the presidency, he and his wife, Rosalind, ended up walking the inaugural parade route. He did not ride in a vehicle, he did not ride in an open top convertible. He walked the parade route. He made his presence known, he made his face visible, he connected with the people. I mean, could you imagine a presidential candidate to this day that would walk down a parade route? And people would argue, hey, it was different times. This was right on the heels of the Kennedy assassination, for crying out loud. Like,
Yeah,
that was
yeah,
on the forefront.
yeah. Was it security for presidential candidates was still being figured out. So he could do things a little more freely than people can today. But at the same time, the sentiment stands of do you imagine any of our current leadership in any way, you know, emulating this man? That's the real scary question, I guess, and that's the real political question we get to ask on this show here today.
Yeah.
I love when we do that.
We're not here to make too many political statements, but it's very interesting. And Carter did have a number of successes in his career. Some, I think, vastly surpass some of his predecessors and successors, and some of which are the Camp David Accord, which were effectively a peace talk between Israel and Egypt at the time, who have been embroiled in a bitter conflict at this point. And not only that, but he did also sign the Panama Canal treaties that reinstated ownership over the canal and control over the canal to Panama itself. It was no longer an overseas American territory. Sounds very akin to a certain
Yeah,
C word we know.
yeah, but it was a very important act. This is the reason that Panama owns its canal now. This is the reason why the U.S. has a even remotely functional relationship with Panama, because they were growing increasingly agitated that the number one economic system in their entire nation they legally had no right to. As you can imagine, the United States of America had similar grievances with a certain other distant empire. So it was a little bit ironic that we were starting to inflict the same pain on someone else.
Rules for thee, but not for me.
And
American foreign policy in a nutshell.
Yeah, Carter fixed some of that there in Panama. He also was kind of the kickstarter for judicial diversity, as in his term he appointed more women and more minorities to federal judiciary positions than had ever previously been allowed to sit in those positions during the entire 100+ year history of the United States of America. Up to that point, the entire 200 years prior, there had been less than what he appointed, including, this is a fun little fact, he got Ruth Bader Ginsburg into a federal judgeship, not the Supreme Court, but a federal judgeship nonetheless. She would later ascend. I think two of his appointees actually ended up making it on the court. Yes, Stephen Breyer as well was another
interesting
who made their way to the Supreme Court. So he paved the way for other very talented people who were being overlooked by the system to get into positions to be noticed.
And Carter, on top of that, and one of the things he's actively credited for, is he's one of the only presidents from the Deep South. Actually, I think he's the first president from the Deep South to try and help heal some of the wounds of racial discrimination and division, start reconnecting that. Obviously, he appointed more minorities and women to positions of power than any of his 38 predecessors. He expanded the American park system, the wildlife refuge system, and the U.S. wilderness system by double, if not triple, in some instances. Like, massively expanded the conservation efforts in place. And that's one of the reasons why Alaska has so much federal land and so many national parks, is a direct result of Carter himself. But some of the things he struggled with as well is a lot of political instability, a lot of argument. I mean, he was right on the heels of the OPEC embargo, the energy crisis, and that is one of the stains on his presidency is the handling of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, no, he did a lot as president, and because of how much he tried to do, like the just listing all the things he did, it would go on and on and on. He's actually the third most legislative president since World War II.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, I believe he is behind only Johnson and Kennedy in terms of the was it what's the next is the percentage of legislation that he was able to push through.
It's interesting because we highlight how important his energy policy was during his presidency. He did a lot of things. He was very much a centrist in a lot of ways, and you see that in a lot of his policies, and it's part of the reason why he unfortunately did lose his reelection campaign is because he would anger both sides of the aisle. Um, some of the big things he dealt with was, like I said, the petroleum embargo, where the United States, up until this point, had relied extremely heavily on foreign oil and imported oil. And one of the things he did was he created the Department of Energy and deregulated oil and gas prices, allowing the market to actually incentivize and try to create additional markets. And one of the interesting things in my mind is he's part of the reason why the United States uh, produces so much oil on their own and has such large oil reserve capacity is because of direct moves that he made. So he has a lot of things that are very conservative in nature, such as that. And then on the flip side, he actively installed solar panels on the White House, input a lot of money to try and develop solar energy, and try to find alternatives to fossil fuels, such as geothermal fuel efficiency. And it's just kind of this interesting dichotomy of you're finding someone here who is pushing for these renewable natural resources while also drilling a bunch more, but creating this sense of American independence at the same time.
Yep. Yeah, he kind of really tried to do everything, and that continues into his post presidency, where he actually becomes best friends with his predecessor, the man he defeated in an election, President Ford. Can you imagine becoming friends with your electoral opponent in this day and age? That is, Jimmy Carter has no enemies. He can make no enemies. Is almost how he chooses to live his life, more or less. And he, he kept going on things that mattered to him and still matter to Americans today, like election reform after the 2000 election debacle with all those vote recountings in Florida and everything. He was on two different committees in 2002 and 2005 putting together legislation packets to try and mitigate the chances of that kind of dispute ever occurring again.
and
And everyone wants the election process to change, and you know
and I
that's the
think
most American thing ever.
I think one of the greatest testaments to Carter's presidency, though, is his foreign policy and his foreign events. Obviously, we highlighted the Camp David Accords and the peace agreements that he would actually do. And he's also the first president to state unambiguously that the Palestinian people must have a homeland if there were to be a peace agreement that would ensure Israel's security. It's something that he got a lot of criticism for, and people would still get a lot of criticism for, but it still harkens true. 50 years later, people are still having that same discussion. It just shows how ahead of the times he was. And one of the things that he also focused on a lot was the Africa policy. Up until this point, from the end of the First World War up until the 1970s, a lot of European nations and the United States kind of left Africa alone. If you're unaware, before the 1910s and 20s, Africa was one of the most colonized, subdivided regions in the world. Every country in Europe had a taste and had a position in Africa. And it wasn't until the 70s that the United States finally started trying to create these bonds and assist these African nations. And it even also talks about in this little blurb on his website here on the Memorial Tribute page that it helped heal these wounds and help connect everything, especially with how much the United States had benefited from the slave trade and this African diaspora that had occurred as a result of this. So there was a humanistic aspect along with it, and that tied right back into the Panama Canal treaties that he signed over the rights to the canal back to Panama. It's something that even France did with Egypt, begrudgingly, but they did.
Yeah. And like just he is one of, like, to put things in context for everyone, he is one of only 4 US presidents in history to win a Nobel Peace Prize, which he won in 2002 for the Camp David Accords.
I know I can
As,
name at least 2 others, but I
yeah,
wonder who the third is.
yeah.
Because I could
As
tell
well.
you Theodore Roosevelt was the first one
Yep.
for his Portsmouth Treaty between Japan and Russia. And then I know Barack Obama won one.
Yep.
Who's Harry
Yeah.
Truman?
Nope. I'll give you a hint though. Carter was the third in history.
Okay, so it went Roosevelt blank, then him. Was it like was it Franklin Roosevelt?
No, no,
Jack.
it was Wilson. Woodrow Wilson.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he joins a very exclusive club of people, and he did it for the Camp David Accords and for the Carter Center, which was the instrument through which he did a lot of human rights work, a lot of fair and free election monitoring, a lot of Habitat for Humanity, a lot of everything got funneled through the Carter Center that he set up, and that won him a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Almost, just 40 years after he's left office, or 20 years after he's left office, he just, here's this lifetime achievement award because apparently you don't stop.
It's very interesting too, because a perfect segue from that is into his defense policy, which is multifaceted and just as complex as the man himself. Because at the time, people looked down at Carter because he was a human rights activist and a man of peace, and many viewed him as a pacifist and looked at him
Oh yeah.
looked down at him because of how he did that. However, he kind of optimizes the military on the same token, because what he did was he got one of the first defense budget increases since the Vietnam War obtained. He started placing nuclear missiles in Europe as a direct counter to the Soviet Union. So he is one of the first presidents to almost directly challenge the Soviet Union in that way.
Yeah.
And then he also led to one of the first real proxies that we saw, where the United States armed Afghani resistance to the Soviet invasion. Kind of crazy how there's current parallels to that too, isn't there?
Yep.
And this eventually did lead to the Soviet Union backing down from their invasion. But one of the biggest testimonials that I think is incredible about his defense policy is Carter managed to get past the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which prevented additional testing, but also made the United States and the Soviet Union to start reducing their nuclear stockpiles. It was one of the first reductions in arms in the entire Cold War. And this was a massive step, and
Yeah,
this
was big, and this was a big deal. This was the first step towards disarmament, and this was entirely because Jimmy Carter viewed weapons of mass destruction as wasteful spending. You only need so many of them. You will almost never fire them. And in his mind, it was better to cut that from the budget and spend the money on things like special operations and stealth bombers and what we would now have today as drone strikes.
Yeah, and that was one of the big controversies of the Carter presidency is he obtained the spending increase for the military, right?
Yep.
But then on the same token, he cut a bunch of programs from the military. He slashed a lot of wasteful spending and like you said, he invested in a lot of future technologies. During this time frame, ARPANET, the precursor to the modern internet, was created and funded.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
There's a
fun thing
lot of
people don't.
coinkydinks like that.
That's a fun thing people don't realize. The internet was a government weapon.
It
Design.
still is. They're tracking everything.
It was no, that's Google. It was designed as a government weapon, and it was prototyped under Jimmy Carter.
But it just, he combated a lot of really serious issues during his presidency. But even still, some of his other policies impact us to this day. And like one of the big things that we talk about is childhood insurance. He is one of the people that signed a bill that basically mandated child and catastrophic coverage for every American family. Which, we don't have universal health care, so having an insurance bill is one of the biggest things.
Yep. And that those darn newborn children refusing to fill out the paperwork for their own health insurance. I mean, do they not know they might get sick in this country?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta sign up right away. And
Yeah.
one of the things that did cost him the election, though, and one of the I think the true testaments to his character is how he handled inflation, because he ended up effectively saving the United States with a really bad inflation, and effectively it cost him a lot. I
Yeah.
mean, short term interest rates skyrocketed to 20%, and unemployment skyrocketed in 1980, but it eventually did pay off. They were the right moves at the time. It just did not help him in his reelection campaign.
Yeah, his strategy for it was the U.S. had been in 10 years of continuously rising inflation, and there were continuing um, irritants and continuing incidents that kept keeping the inflation prices rising instead of stabilizing and dropping. And so he employed a man who basically told him, "This will destroy you politically, but it will fix the economy." And he's one of the few people in just as a politician who was willing to look at that and go, hit the button. He greenlit a policy that he knew would destroy him because it was the right thing to do to fix the economy.
The funny and truly sad part about this is that policy is what really kickstarted and highlighted the economic growth under the first term of the Reagan administration. Effectively, the policy that set that up for success guaranteed Reagan's second term
Yeah.
because
Oh,
the economy was so great. Well, there's part of a reason.
yeah.
And then
Well, it also creates like I think the number one most lopsided map in U.S. history.
it is the most
Where
lopsided election
yeah,
in American history.
yeah, where Jimmy Carter gets 49 electoral votes off of, I think, 5 states and the capital,
Yeah, it
and
was.
it's one of those maps that you think
But one of
he's
the
again.
last big nails in the coffin to Carter's reelection campaign is the Iran hostage crisis, which happened after the first real Arab Spring, which saw Iran have a very stark contrast in the government, where their previously democratic government that was favorable towards the United States changed and took a hard turn in policy. They became a theocratic government, but in doing so, a number of American citizens were captured and were
Yeah,
held hostage.
yeah, it was a really messed up time for international relations over there, and Carter does get the job done since the hostages are released on inauguration day for Reagan. Like Reagan's inauguration day is the day they're released, so I'm not sure how much Reagan standing on the podium being sworn in had to do with that.
I I'm saying this from a modern perspective with retrospective opinions, but I almost feel like the hostages were used specifically to get Reagan in office, who may have been more favorable. I mean, we see a lot of political moves with that now with hostages, especially between Russia and America. But, they had been held for 444 days. That is pretty on par with the traditional American election cycle. And one of the things that really truly led to a change in support for Carter was that the first, uh, pretty much the first anniversary of the hostages being taken on the day before the election, Carter spent most of the time just trying to negotiate and trying to fight back. I mean, he the Iranian government basically teased him 2 days before the election, saying it was possible for the hostages to be released. So he flew back to Washington immediately and started trying to talk and trying to get the people released. And a lot of his own opinions on it also hinged on that. He believed his reelection hinged on the hostages, and unfortunately, to his detriment, it did, but not in the way he thought.
Yeah, and he was, yeah, and also he was, he moved himself out of the eye of campaigning to actually go and do the job he had at the time instead of looking at the job he had in the future. Which, don't get me wrong, the two were tied, but most presidents don't leave the campaign trail for anything during election season, and he did, because that was how important this was to his political career and to him personally, probably at this point, because it had been a year of trying to get this problem solved. Jimmy Carter does not like unsolved problems.
But I think we did a great job of describing some of the highlights of Carter's presidency. I really just wanted to highlight some of the exceptional things that this man had done in probably what is one of the most hidden presidencies. I mean, again, his contemporaries really looked down on a lot of his policies, and he really did aggravate and irritate both sides. But you can see that it was a man who cared for his country, who was deeply patriotic and deeply just
Yeah,
wanted to improve the situation for everyone. And
Carter's proving grounds, unlike most presidents, wasn't his presidency itself. It was everything that came after. The Carter Center, Habitat for Humanity, that's immortalized him, and the fact that so many of his policies proved to be stable and long term and forward thinking.
they were
That's
so progressive that we
that
don't see the value of it until the 21st century.
Yeah, like that. That's history is his vindicator,
And
not not his own time, which is very rare. That's a very rare thing for to happen to a human being.
and I think as time goes on, his presidency will become even more evergreen and will only improve with time, because that is a rare thing. A lot of times we look back with our rose-colored glasses, and even then we tend to pick apart decisions and policies that presidents make. Very rarely do we go, he might have been onto something, and this is the case that's happening to Carter.
Yeah,
I just, it's been good to see him be vindicated for his hard work. And yeah, let us know what you thought down below. We wanted to do this as a memorial, as a history channel, as people who live in the United States. I mean,
so that's a little salute to number 39 there, as the number is finally retired after over 40 years.
God, God rest his soul. And yeah, have a good one, everyone. Rest in peace.